My name is Dave Manzo. I'm the president of Cotting School. This is not my usual voice. I've got that little cold that's been going around, so when folks go to shake hands with me, I give you the elbow. So, I'm here to welcome you to our school this morning. This is Cotting's 125th year. We are very, very proud. We are very, very proud of this extraordinary tradition. Cotting was started by two doctors at Boston Children's Hospital, Doctors Bradford and Thorndike. And they saw children coming into the orthopedic clinic at Children's who were not going to school. There were a lot of reasons they weren't going to school. They weren't going to school for architectural barriers. Those things have pretty much gone away. They weren't going to school for stigma, and some of that has gone away, surely not all of it. But Dr. Bradford went to Europe and went to look at programs across Europe. He went to Copenhagen, he went to Milan, he came back here, put an ad in the Boston newspapers and said, come, we want to start a school in Boston for children. And people came, and night after night, year after year, they had this idea of starting this experiment. And we are the results of that experiment. I'd love to see a show of hands of folks who are at Cotting for the very first time. It's just great. So, welcome. We hope that you'll come again and again. So, on a monthly basis, you can check this out on our Cotting website. We have an opportunity for folks to visit our school while our kids are here, and that's really the way to see our school. I mean, this school is great, the facility's great, the staff are great. But what really makes Cotting is being in our facility when our kids are here. So if you'd like to come, you have to sign up ahead of time. We have our information sessions on a monthly basis. You can just come and visit us and get a real tour of our school. We serve children who have a variety of complex challenges. We have children who something might have happened genetically, something might have happened in utero, something might have happened at the moment of birth. We're typically developing something happened in middle school or high school. But what I like to say is this is an unbelievable place because the students feel that this is their school. There's a tremendous amount of pride. And in June, when we're all up on the stage for graduation, I always close my graduation address with the students by saying, once a Falcon, is when the Cotting School Falcons. They all respond, always a Falcon. There's a real feeling of pride that you're always part of this community. So my job today is to introduce our guest, Andrew Solomon. And, we wanted to do something very special for year 125, and we couldn't think of doing anything better than inviting Andrew Solomon to come and speak with us. I think so many of you have either read the book, Far from the Tree, or if you haven't, it's unbelievable. But the documentary has been out for a while now, and he really captures something that I think parallels what we have in our school. It's really the value and the importance of every life. We're not all the same. We have all different sets of skills. We have all different ways of looking at the world, all different ways of experiencing the world, but we are all of great value. And that message really was something that resonated with us. So before Andrew speaks, we're going to show a short video. He will speak, and then we'll have a chance for questions and answers. We'll have two folks with mics who will bring them to you so everyone can hear your questions. So I'm going to say less. We're going to see the video and have more time for Andrew to say more. So welcome to Cotting School. Thank you.
Here this morning, bright and early on a Saturday, a cold, wintry Saturday. So thank you for that. Even in purely non-religious terms, homosexuality represents a misuse of the sexual faculty. It is a pathetic little second-rate substitute for reality, a pitiable flight from life. As such, it deserves no glamorization, no rationalization, and above all, no pretense that it is anything but a pernicious sickness. That's Time magazine in 1966, when I was 3 years old. And in the last 2 years, gay marriage has become the law of the land, at least for the time being. And I set out to write my book and to do this investigation, determined to understand how that happened. How did something that was universally understood to be an illness, the illness of homosexuality, turn into an identity, the identity of gayness? And if it were possible for there to be a shift from an illness to an identity for gay people, then what other illnesses were there out there that also functioned as identities, that were simply waiting for their moment to be transformed and realized? When I was about 6 years old, I went with my mother and my brother to a shoe store. It had a name that probably wouldn't go down so well today. It was called Indian Walk Shoes, now in New York. And in Indian Walk Shoes, my brother and I had our shoes fitted, and then the salesman said that we could each have a balloon to take home. And my brother wanted a red balloon, and I wanted a pink balloon. And my mother said that she thought I'd really rather have a blue balloon. And I said, no, I really wanted the pink balloon. And she reminded me that my favorite color was blue. The fact that my favorite color now is blue, but I'm still gay, will give you some sense of a mother's influence and its limits. When I was growing up, my mother used to say all the time, the love for your children is like no other feeling in the world. And until you have children, you don't know what it feels like. And when I was little, that made me feel so lucky that bringing up my brother and me was so central to her experience of life and was one of the great joys of her experience. And when I was an adolescent, she said it would make me anxious because I thought, but I think I'm gay, and if I'm gay, I presumably can't have children. And so I worried about it. And then after I came out, she would say it, and it would make me angry. And I would say, you know that's not the path I'm on. I want you to stop saying that. She never did. The love for your children is like no other feeling in the world. And until you have children, you don't know what it feels like. In 1994, my editors at the New York Times Magazine asked me to write an article about deaf culture. And I was very taken aback for two reasons. First of all, because I had mostly been doing international reporting. My editor said to me, this is a foreign society in our own midst. And secondly, because I had thought of deafness entirely as a disability, those poor people, they couldn't hear. And I didn't understand what it meant to look at deaf culture. But I went out into the deaf world, and I went to deaf clubs, and I went to deaf theater, and I went into deaf households, and I even went to the Miss Deaf America contest in Nashville, Tennessee, where everyone complained about that slurry Southern signing. And as I immersed myself deeper and deeper in the world of the deaf, I became persuaded that deafness really was a culture, that it was a culture united around the shared use of sign language. Not only that it was a culture, but also that it was a beautiful culture. And I remember having one day when I had gone off into the National Association of the Deaf meeting, and I walked into a gigantic room 3 times the size of this one, with people, all the conversations flying off the ends of their hands. And I remember thinking, I wish I were deaf. Which is not to say that I wished I couldn't hear, because my hearing is very useful to me and I use it all the time. It was that I felt that this was a beautiful society, and in that instance I was the outsider. And while I could have spent years trying to master sign language, I would have remained the outsider, despite having done it, because I wasn't truly part of that society, and there was no way that I could be. And so the roles were reversed. And then I learned that most deaf children are born to hearing parents. But those hearing parents have traditionally done all they could to make their children function in the mainstream hearing culture. And that a lot of those children have discovered deaf identity in adolescence or thereafter when it's come as a great revelation to them. And I thought how similar that was to the situation of gay kids, who are mostly born to straight parents, who mostly have tried to get them to function in what they think of as the mainstream reality, and who often have discovered gay culture in adolescence or thereafter when it's come as a great liberation to them. And so I began to have the feeling that there was a pattern here. And then a friend of mine had a daughter who was a dwarf, and she was suddenly facing all of the same questions that I had been facing about being gay and that the deaf people had faced about being deaf. And she started asking what began to sound like very familiar questions. She said, do I bring my daughter up to think she's just like everyone else, only shorter? Or do I try somehow to instill in her a sense of dwarf identity? Do I join the little people of America? Do I help her to celebrate who she is? And I thought, here it is again. Here it is again, a family that perceives itself to be normal, with a child whom they perceive to be different, or in some sense abnormal, and who are trying to make sense of what they should do. And it was at that point that I came up with the idea that there are really two kinds of identities that people have, children in particular. They're what I call vertical identities. Vertical because they're handed down generationally from parent to child. So your ethnicity, your nationality, usually your language, frequently your religion. Those are identities that are handed down generation to generation, and while some of them can be very difficult, nobody is suggesting that the solution is to do genetic research to change them. So you could argue that it's more difficult in the United States as it's currently constructed to be a person of color than it is to be white. But nobody has proposed that the solution to that is to do genetic research on how to ensure that the next generation of children born to Latino or Asian or African American parents come out with blonde hair and blue eyes. What people are instead doing is to try to change the society. So those identities get reinforced. But there are also what I call horizontal identities. Horizontal because they are not passed down generationally from parent to child, but are rather identities children have that their parents don't have. And I call them horizontal because they have to be learned as identities from a peer group. So if you look at deafness or dwarfism, or Down syndrome or autism, or schizophrenia or multiple severe disabilities, if you look at the families of people who commit crimes, or families bringing up children conceived in rape, or families of people who are transgender, you find over and over again in these instances that you're looking at situations in which parents have to love a child who has a very different life experience than any life experience that parents have had previously. And so I looked at those horizontal identities, and I felt that there were really two obligations that all parents have. One is to change your children. You have to change your children. Not changing your children is neglect. You have to give them an education. You have to try to point them toward moral values. You have to give them a sense of what it is that makes their lives special and beautiful. You have to teach them a whole lot of things. And the other responsibility is to celebrate your children for exactly who they are and make them feel great about their own identity. And some things clearly need to be changed, and some things clearly need to be celebrated, and a great deal falls in a foggy, nebulous middle where parents don't know which thing to do. And as I looked at the parents who are struggling with that middle over and over again and not knowing whether to change their children or celebrate them in any particular regard, I came to the idea that there really is a difference, and it was valuable to me to realize this because I hadn't understood it within my own family. There is a difference between love and acceptance. And while I think acceptance should always be the ultimate goal of love, I don't believe it's the same thing. Love is something that's ideally there from the moment a baby is born. It's the feeling that you would do anything for this child. But acceptance of who your child is a process, and it takes time. And it always takes time. It takes time even if your child doesn't have an exceptional identity. Acceptance is a process. And I had mistaken my parents' lack of initial acceptance for who I was for a lack of love. And as I did this research, I came to think that they had always loved me. And it was only the acceptance that lagged, that took them a while. And acceptance generally takes a while. And all things considered, it hadn't taken them so very much longer than it took anyone else's parents to get there. Now, acceptance has to operate at three levels. There's self-acceptance, there's family acceptance, and there's acceptance in the larger society. And each of those levels feeds the others. So if you have a child who has really good self-acceptance, it will be easier for his family to accept him. But if that child is living in a society, and the parents are living in a society in which that form of difference is more broadly accepted, that will also facilitate the parents' acceptance of their own child. So they're all very enmeshed. And I found as I talked to parents who were were dealing with children who were different, that many of them described a trajectory in which they had initially been outraged and had then gone on to be bewildered and had then ended up at acceptance or even at celebration. And I would like to say that that's a constant linear model, but it isn't. Parents get to the point of celebration and then they have a major medical setback where something happens to them socially and they're back once again at being outraged or bewildered. It's a constant moving among those 3 points of view. Now, I'm going to tell you the stories of some of the people who I interviewed while I was working on the book. And I'm going to start with Clinton Brown, who's the dwarf you just saw in the video. When Clint was born, what his parents were actually told was that he wouldn't live very long and that they might want to leave him in the hospital where he could die quietly. And his mother did think about it for 3 days. And at the end of 3 days, she said, no, that's my baby, and I want to take him home. And even if he ends up dying, at least I'll know that I brought him home and I did my best with him. And so she did bring him home. And over the first year of his life, she took him to various doctors, every one of whom said, diastrophic dwarfism, it's such a disabling condition. Are you prepared for this? Are you prepared for that? Are you prepared that he'll never know who you are? Are you prepared that he'll never be able to walk? Are you prepared that he'll never be able to speak? Are you prepared? Are you prepared? Are you prepared? And all of these narratives of the terrible things that they had. And then despite not having a lot of resources educationally or financially, and despite not having the internet, because it was the 1980s, his mother, Cheryl Brown, made her way to the best doctor for the treatment of skeletal dysplasias, dwarfing conditions in the United States. It was Dr. Stephen Kopetz at Johns Hopkins. And she took Clint to see Dr. Kopetz, and she described walking to his office. Clint was a year old. And Dr. Kopetz picked Clint up and held him up to the light and said, let me tell you, that's going to be a handsome young man one day. And she talked about how transformative that is. And when I speak, especially to groups of doctors or social workers or teachers or others who are in direct care, I say over and over again, the way you frame the difference of this child in your interactions with the family can have a profound determinative effect on how those families and how those children fare over the period that follows. So during his childhood, as he said in the video, Clint had 30 major surgical procedures, including some in which he was completely immobilized because they were spinal surgeries. So he was stuck in the hospital for months and months at a time. And he figured there's nothing else very much to do, so he might as well focus on his schoolwork. And he did. He focused on his schoolwork, and he worked very hard. And he turned out he was better at schoolwork than anyone in his family had ever been. And he eventually became the first member of his family to go to college. And he went to college not far from where his parents lived, in Hofstra on Long Island. And he joined a fraternity, and he lived on campus. And he had a specially fitted car that was made to accommodate his diminutive figure, which he could drive. And one day I got a call from his mother, and she said, I was driving home from work today, and I went past a bar, and there was Clinton's car parked outside the car. She said, I thought to myself, he was 3 feet tall, they're 6 feet tall, 2 beers for them is 4 beers for him. I wanted to go in and interrupt, but I knew I couldn't do that, so I drove home and left 11 messages on his voicemail. He said, and then I thought, if someone had told me when he was born that my future worry would be that he would go drinking and driving with his college buddies, I'd have been so thrilled to have that problem. And I said, what do you think you did? What do you think you did that brought about this extraordinary transformation? What did you do that allowed a child for whom there was such a dire prognosis to emerge as someone who's happy and popular and accomplished and well settled, with good self-esteem? And she said, what did we do? We loved him, that's all. Clinton just always had that light in him, and we were fortunate enough to be the first to see it there on those joyful occasions of my life, and that he is thriving. I'll tell you the story of another dwarf. This is someone named Kiki Peck, who has knee dysplasia. Some forms of dwarfism affect primarily stature and don't come with other disabling adjunct problems. Dystrophic dwarfism with knee dysplasia both have many side problems. Lichen dysplasia affects the development of cartilage and therefore means that people have very creaky arthritic bones starting in early childhood. It affects the development of the eye. It has various other challenges. Kiki Peck, nonetheless, has always managed to keep up an aura of incorrigible enthusiasm about life. And when she was 8 years old, her mother developed breast cancer. And she called her children in and she said, I've been diagnosed with breast cancer. The doctors think I'll be fine, but I'm going to have chemotherapy, and I'm going to lose my hair, so I'm going to shave my head in the meanwhile, so that it doesn't all fall out in great long pieces. And Kiki said, well, I'll help you shave your head. And Liz said, well, okay. So Kiki helped her mother shave her head, and when they finished, Kiki said, and now I'm going to shave my head. Her mother said, what are you talking about? Why would you do that? And Kiki said, I spend a lot of time feeling different all by myself, and I know how lonely it can be. And I would like for you to have someone who's different in the same way that you are at the same time. And I thought what an extraordinary perspective that was for an 8-year-old to have. And I think that Clinton and Kiki are people not who have managed to do very well despite having a difference, but people who manage to do very well in part because of having a difference, because of the lessons they learned from that difference, and because of the different ways that they had to approach it. I'm going to quote you from one other magazine from the 1960s, the last one of this lecture, I promise. This is the Atlantic Monthly on Down syndrome. It's an article written by Joseph Fletcher, who is a well-known American ethicist, in a liberal journal, and it was his commentary on Down syndrome. He wrote, there is no reason to feel guilty about putting a Down syndrome child away, whether it is put away in the sense of hidden in a sanitarium or in a more responsible, lethal sense. It is sad, yes, dreadful, but it carries no guilt. True guilt arises only from an offense against a person, and a Downs is not a person. Now, the fact that everyone makes shocked sounds when I recite that reflects how very much the situation has changed in our perspective on people's differences and disabilities. No journal of liberal opinion today would publish an article that made any such suggestions. And I feel like a lot of ink has been spilled on the shifting attitudes towards gay rights and race rights and gender rights. But we've had a real transformation as a society. At least we have mostly had a real transformation as a society in our understanding of difference and disability altogether. And the scale of that change sometimes gets lost in the national discourse, and it hasn't been publicized so well. But someone who had worked for years with people with Down syndrome described me being in Los Angeles and going out to lunch with the actress who appeared on the television show Glee. And she said, one was Down syndrome. And she said people were coming up and asking for her autograph. She was a celebrity first and a person with a disability second. I never dreamed I would live to see such a day. People with Down syndrome are now living almost twice as long as they lived in 1967. Some of them are living semi-independently at least. Many of them have jobs of one kind or another. Some are actors, some are writers, one is a model. It's extraordinary, the shift that's taken place. And I'm going to take the story of Tom and Karen Robards, who were a hard-charging Wall Street couple who had a child early and were very shocked to have a child with Down syndrome. And as the years went by, they felt that there was no place where their child would get an adequate education. They didn't like the educational opportunities that were available to them. And so in the early 1980s, they got together with a few other families who also had children with Down syndrome. They persuaded the Archdiocese of New York to lend them 2 unused public lavatories that they converted into classrooms. And they started teaching their children in those 2 lavatories. And that experiment in teaching with a small group of children eventually grew into something called the Cook Center, which has been a great center of teaching for people with Down syndrome and has helped in many ways to establish the protocols that have allowed people with DS to function so much better than they otherwise have and would have. And when I spoke to the Robards, I said, look, this has been your life. You've given yourself completely to this. I said, do you regret it? Do you wish your son David didn't have Down syndrome? Would you like to make it go away? And Tom Robart said, well, for David, I'd like to make it go away, because for David, it's a difficult way of being in the world. And for David, I would like to give him an easier life. He said, but these people have something to tell us. And if we come up with a society in which we eliminate Down syndrome altogether, it would be a terrible loss. It would be a terrible loss for us all. So the personal wish and the social wish are not completely aligned. And then Karen Robart said, well, she said, I guess if I'm with Tom, that for David, I'd like to change it because I would like to give David an easier life. She said, but speaking for myself, I would never have believed when he was born 25 years ago I would come to this point, but I have. Speaking for David, I would change it, but speaking for myself, I wouldn't give up these experiences for anything in the world. They've made me a better, more deeply engaged, more profoundly occupied identity than I would ever have had without them. And speaking for myself, they're the most precious experiences of my life. I was very struck as I did this work by the relationship between medical progress, which I believe in, and social progress, which I believe in. The social progress is what I've just described to you, but we live in a time when cochlear implants, which are a device that's surgically implanted and connected to a transmitter and allows sound information to travel, bypassing the structures of the ear directly to the sound centers of the brain. I feel like cochlear implants mean that most children who are born deaf today are receiving implants and are being brought up to function as much as possible in the hearing world. There's a new compound, or not so new anymore, called BMN 111 that was developed by BioMarin Laboratories in California. It blocks the action of the gene that causes achondroplasia, the most common form of dwarfism. In rodent studies, rodents who have the achondroplasia gene and who are given BMN 111 grow to full size. And it's now beginning to be used, in human children. And of course, there are blood tests that allow people earlier and earlier in a pregnancy to recognize whether they are carrying a pregnancy with a genetic anomaly and to make a decision to terminate that pregnancy if they wish to do so. And I, as I said, believe in both the social and the medical progress that are taking place, but I wish they could see one another better. I feel as though in some ways all of these social dynamics that have moved so wonderfully forward are constantly challenged by a set of medical dynamics that say they will eliminate these conditions completely from among us. And I had a researcher who I worked with very closely, Jacob Schamberg, who is deaf, and he sent me an email one night and said, well, I'm pretty comfortable with my disability and don't see the cochlear implant as an evil plot set to destroy deaf culture. I do get a sense of impending extinction. There will always be deaf people worldwide, but there's a real possibility that it will be near eliminated in the developed world in the next 50 to 100 years. When I say near, that's because there will always be cultural holdouts, untreatable conditions, immigrants, and so on. But no more people like me. And I remember thinking what a lonely expression that was, no more people like me. And I thought, what would it be like to think there will be no more people like me, whatever that means? There will be no more Jews, there will be no more black people, there will be no more of any other category people associate themselves with, there will be no more Episcopalians. What would happen? And I became very interested in that question of the cure and of how the cure functions. I'm going to quote you from Jim Sinclair, who's a writer with autism. He does not use spoken language at all. He does write. He hasn't written very much, but everything he's written has been very powerful and very impressive. And he wrote, when parents say, I wish my child did not have autism, what they're really saying is, I wish the autistic child I have did not exist, and I had a different, non-autistic child instead. Read that again. This is what we hear when you mourn over our existence. And this is what we know when you pray for a cure, is that your fondest wish is that someday we will cease to be, and strangers you can love will move in behind our faces. And that's an extreme way of phrasing it, but it's a lesson that many people who have children with differences and disabilities have talked about. The question of when the attempt to change your children and correct what's wrong in your children is helpful to make them function better in the world, and the extent to which it's denying who they really are and trying to change them into someone else. And I think of Betsy Burns, someone I interviewed who had a daughter with very severe autism. And Betsy described all of the different ways that they had attempted to treat the autism, and they had attempted to improve her condition and improve what she could do. And she finally said to me, oh, and Cece has spoken 3 times in her life. She had said nothing until she was 9 years old. And then one day she said, when her mother turned the TV off, she said, I want the television on. And her kids looked at each other and waited for their world to change. And she said nothing more for 2 years. And then she was at a school play, and someone said, what color is the king's robe? And Cece said, it's purple. And so she's spoken only 3 times. In each instance, she's spoken appropriately to what's going on. And Betsy said to have a child who's never spoken is to assume your child doesn't know what language is and isn't aware of what's going on. But to have a child who's spoken 3 times like that is to wonder all the time, what is it that allowed on those 3 occasions the child to get past the traffic jam in her brain, and what else is in there waiting to be said, and what is she knowing, and what is she understanding? But she finally said to me one day, Cece is the ultimate Zen lesson. Why does Cece have autism? Because Cece has autism. And what is it like being Cece? Being Cece. Because no one else is. It is what it is. It isn't anything else. And maybe you'll never change it. And maybe you should stop trying. I was moved by all of these parents and their approach to their children and their sense of acceptance, their sense of this process of acceptance they went through. And so I wanted to look at the most extreme instance of this. I had, as I mentioned at the beginning, a chapter on people who committed crimes, and I went up and interviewed the parents of Dylan Klebold, who was one of the perpetrators of the Columbine massacre, which, as most of you will remember, was the one in 1999 that set the stage for so much of the school violence we've seen in this country since then. And I went to spend a weekend with the Klebolds, and having resisted doing an interview for years, when I finally got to them, they were so full of their story they couldn't stop telling it. And in the course of our first weekend together, I recorded some 20 hours of interviews. And finally, on Sunday night, we were all exhausted. We were sitting in the kitchen. Sue was making dinner. And I said, if Dylan were here now, is there anything you want to ask him? And his father said, there sure is. I want to ask him what the hell he thought he was doing. And his mother looked at the floor. And she thought for a minute. And then she said, I would ask him to forgive me for being his mother and never knowing what was going on inside his head. And a few years later, I went out to dinner with Sue Klebold, one of many dinners we had together in Denver, and I reminded her of that thing that she had said the first weekend we met. And she said, you know, when it first happened, I used to wish that I had never married and I had never had children. If I hadn't gone to Ohio State, I wouldn't have met Tom, we wouldn't have married, these children wouldn't have existed, and this terrible thing wouldn't have happened. She said, but over time, I've come to feel that I love the children I had so much that I wouldn't want to imagine a life without them, even at the price of this pain. When I say that, I'm talking about my own pain, of course, not the pain of other people. But life is full of suffering, and this is mine. So while I recognize that it would have been better for the world if Dylan had never been born, I've decided that it would not have been better for me. And I was very struck by that extraordinary statement, by the way that all of these parents talked about how much they valued the children they had, and how close they were to these children, and how they would change them. And I thought, but surely, in fact, they would want to make changes, and they would want to make them as quickly as they could, and they would want to have different, easier lives for themselves. And then I realized that we not only take care of our children because we love them, but also love them because we take care of them. And the process of taking care of these children had been utterly transformative for the parents who had been taking care of them, and it required so much energy that it gave birth to an enormous devotion. And if some glorious angel were to drop through the roof of any school or any building in the country and offer all of the parents in the room the opportunity to exchange their children for other, better children, almost all of those parents would cling to the children they have and say, I don't want better children, I love the child I have. And it shouldn't be so extraordinary that these children are loved by their parents, and that love may be profound, and that it may be complex. I spent time with the family of David and Sarah Hatton. They had a child who was born with very extreme disabilities, unable to walk, unable to talk, blind, and several other challenges. And they were told it was a complete genetic fluke and that they should go ahead and have more children. They had a second child who was fine, and then a third child who had the same syndrome as the first. And they were very determined to keep these children at home with them, and they kept them as long as they could. But when Sarah herniated a disc trying to lift one of them out of the bathtub, they realized they needed to put them into a group home where there were better facilities for taking care of them. And so they sued the state, and they got the state of Connecticut to build a group home near them in Hartford, and they went and saw their children there every day. And one day, there was someone giving a bath to their younger child, and she left the room to get a towel, which she was not supposed to do, and the Velcro harness he was in gave way, and he slipped under the water, and he drowned. And when I went to his funeral, his mother said, let me bury here the rage I feel to have been twice robbed. Once of the child I wanted, and once of the son I loved. And she had said that she chose not to bring a lawsuit against the organization, the group home, except to demand that this particular individual be taken away from working with disabled children. But she said, otherwise, she said, I didn't want to discourage anyone who might have made a career out of taking care of children like ours, because it's very difficult work, it doesn't pay very well, and we need all the good people we can get. But I was struck by that idea of twice robbed, and another parent of a child, two children also with multiple very severe disabilities, said to me, people always give us these little sayings like, God doesn't give you any more than you can handle. But children like ours are not preordained as a gift. They're a gift because that's what we have chosen. And that idea of choice became easy after having given birth to children with a variety of disabling conditions, whether they expected to find meaning in the experience of bringing those children up. And then the researchers went back 5 years later to look at how the children were doing. And the children of mothers who had said that they anticipated finding meaning were doing better on every possible clinical measure than the children of mothers who saw no such possibility. So this thing of finding meaning or of forging meaning, as the case may be, is a matter that has a profound effect on the mental health of the parent and the child, and indeed of the whole penumbra around them. And if you search deep enough, it is possible to find meaning in most experiences of adversity. It's not that some people happen to see it and other people happen not to see it. It is a choice. It's not an easy choice. It's not always completely a choice, but it is a choice. And that choice is what I wanted to look at, because the people I interviewed have by and large ended up grateful for lives that they would have done almost anything to avoid. And I felt in the end that this negotiation of difference was very consistent across all the categories I was looking at. If you think that you have something in common only with other families of children with dystrophic dwarfism, you're talking about quite a small population. If you think you have something in common with every family that's dealt with surprising and shocking differences between themselves and their children, then you find that you're looking at a nearly universal human experience. Because even people whose children don't carry obvious disabilities are negotiating difference in their household, are dealing with sometimes looking at their child and thinking, what planet did you arrive from? And so our differences ultimately can be the thing that unites us rather than a thing that draws us asunder from one another. Before I started working on this project, I thought that classrooms in which disabled and non-disabled children had contact with each other were good for disabled children, but not for non-disabled children. That the disabled children got access to better education much of the time, and the non-disabled children were slowed down in their academic pursuits by having a disabled child there. But having now spent a lot of time in such classrooms, I feel they're certainly not the only model, and they're certainly not appropriate in all instances, but I feel like the people who benefit the most when they take place are the non-disabled children. who grow up unafraid of people who are different, and who grow up accustomed to interacting with the full range of humanity, and who benefit from that far more than they would by getting through multiplication tables 2 weeks earlier. I was in the middle of working on this book when I decided to have children myself. And people said to me, how can you be deciding to have children in the midst of a book about everything that can go wrong? And I had to explain over and over again, but it isn't a book about everything that can go wrong. It's a book about how much meaning there can be and how much joy there can be in the experience of parenting, even when everything seems to be going wrong. And rather than frighten me off of the experience of parenthood, it propelled me toward it. So I will explain my own family in the most truncated way that I can. My husband is the biological father of 2 children with some lesbian friends in Minneapolis. My best friend from college had gotten divorced but wanted to have a child, and so she and I have a daughter who lives with her mother in Fort Worth, Texas, but visits often. And then John and I wanted to have a child to be at home with us full time, and so we have George, of whom I'm the biological father, John is the adoptive father, and the egg donor and our surrogate was Laura, the lesbian mother of his 2 biological children. So the shorthand is 6 parents of 4 children in 3 states. And there seem to be people who think that the existence of families such as mine somehow undermines the integrity of families such as theirs. And I don't accept those subtractive models of love, only additive ones. And I believe that in the same way that we need species diversity to keep the planet healthy, we also need this diversity of kinds of affection to sustain the ecosphere of kindness. Now, when our son George was born, it was, of course, a very joyful day. And the next morning, the pediatrician came in, and she said, George is not extending his legs correctly. And I said, oh. And she said, that could be a sign of neurological damage. And I said, what? And she said, and also, insofar as he is extending them, he's doing so asymmetrically, which could point to the possibility of a mass in his brain. And by the way, he has a very large head and should be tested for hydrocephalus. And I felt my whole self melting and pouring out onto the floor. And we were sent off to do the testing that followed. We went to the MRI machine, we went to the CAT scanner, we went for an arterial blood draw, we went for other kinds of x-rays. And there we were with this child who was less than a day old. And I felt angry, and I felt frustrated, and I felt terrified. And I thought, here I've been writing this whole book about how much meaning people have found in having children with differences and disabilities, and I don't want to join their number. And then I realized as we were walking along that I was thinking of this in terms of illness, and that like all parents across societies and across history, I wanted to protect my child from illness. But I thought if he had any of the things we were testing for, that would also be his identity. And if that was to be his identity, it was to be my identity as well. And I suddenly heard this voice in the back of my mind that said, the love for your children is unlike any other feeling in the world. And until you have children, you don't know what it feels like. So we went through this for about 5 hours, and at the end of 5 hours, we were called in by the pediatrician, who told us that all the tests were normal and that George was now extending his legs in fully appropriate manner. And when I asked her what she thought had been going on in the morning, she said he had probably had a cramp. But I think children really ensnared me in that moment when I connected fatherhood and loss. And I think if I hadn't been embarked on this project, I would never have noticed that happening. I had encountered so much strange love, and now I fell into its bewitching patterns. At some level, I had sometimes felt the parents I was talking to were noble fools, insisting that they were having this profound experience with children who seemed to me to be thankless, embarking with them on a lifetime's voyage and trying to build identity out of misery. But that day in the hospital with George, I discovered that my research had built me a plank, and that I was ready to join them on their ship. Thank you. questions now, if you have a few minutes. Questions, anyone? Yes,
I
in the
have a
back.
question, Andrew. How did you find the people you interviewed?
How did I find the people I interviewed? It was a complicated process. I found them in every possible way. I found some of them by talking to people I knew who would say, "Oh, I had a friend who had dwarfism. You should really talk to my friend so-and-so." I found some of them by going to national organizations like the National Association of the Deaf or the Little People of America or the National Down Syndrome Society. I found a lot of them because once you get tapped into those networks, you meet people. I found some through doctors. When I worked on schizophrenia, for example, I worked with people in McLean who helped to identify patients who were interested in and willing to talk to me. And I sort of gradually built up a portfolio of people in each of these different areas. I did, when I was doing trans children, I got involved in a group called Trans Youth Family Advocates that helped me a lot with that. So there were a lot of different approaches. It took a long time. I mean, the book took me 11 years, and it's kind of a chunky book, so people often think it took me 11 years just because it took a long time to write all those words down. But what really took 11 years was finding everyone and doing the interviews. Anyone else? Yes.
I'm sorry to say that I haven't read your book yet, but one area that I was interested in is when you worked with these families, did you ever do any work with like your siblings and how this kind of affected them? Because I was thinking about that, you know, as they get older and, you know.
The question is about siblings. Yes, I did, and I've written a certain amount about siblings in the book, but it got to be an overwhelming amount of material, so it's done in a relatively cursory fashion. I found that siblings, by and large, were attached to their siblings who had differences or disabilities, but in some instances jealous of all of the time and attention they got. And I thought the attitude was well summed up by Tegan Delahovey, whose brother has Down syndrome, who said to me, on any given day, I would feel angry that we had to stay in because of Adam. I would feel angry that I had to stay home and take care of Adam. I would feel angry that we couldn't eat something because Adam couldn't eat it. She said, but in the overall, she said, I would never have wanted to imagine a life without him. He was my brother and I felt deeply attached to him. That was what I heard in many cases. There's obviously a broad range of sibling experience and there are different ways that families do it. One of the things that was interesting to me was that in the 1960s and early 70s, the kind of popular line was that if you had a disabled child, you should institutionalize that child so that your non-disabled children would have a good life and wouldn't be weighed down by all the attention the disabled child would require and by the embarrassment of being seen with the disabled sibling. And the rhetoric has gradually changed, and now the rhetoric mostly says that if you have a disabled child and you have other children, you should keep that child at home, because people realize that all of these non-disabled siblings who had seen their disabled siblings sent off to institutions thought, gee, if something happens to me, I guess I'll get sent off to an institution too. And so it's better for the non-disabled siblings to have their disabled siblings at home. What's striking in that shift in narrative is that it's a narrative entirely of the non-disabled sibling, and that it's not a narrative of what's best for the disabled person. I think as a society that we've come to a point of understanding that it's good for the disabled person to be at home. And sometimes the siblings of the disabled person volunteer that they will take care of their disabled sibling when their parents are eventually unable to do so. And sometimes the non-disabled sibling says, I love this person, but I can't take full responsibility for him, and that's a negotiation within families that can go in either direction. The parents who have a disabled child have a kind of moral obligation to take care of that child, having produced that child, I think, at one level or another, if they're able to do so, psychologically able and physically able. Siblings don't have that obligation. Siblings should have freedom to make their own choice, but quite a lot of them end up being interested, and a lot of siblings end up getting training in and working in areas of care related to the condition of their child. Anyone else? Yes.
Are there common trajectories or course of actions that bring
parents from rescuing to accepting? Could you chart that tipping point a little bit, both for parents and maybe for folks with disabilities as well?
It's an interesting and it's a complicated question. I think as I said in the talk, I think parents often start out being not very comfortable with their child's difference or disability, and not very comfortable with the change in their own life narrative, which has gone from being parents of who are living in the normal world to parents who are dealing with this challenge. And the talk, I kind of talked a lot about parents who made extraordinary accommodations and who came really to love these children. One has to emphasize that a large portion of the children available for adoption in the United States are disabled children, and that many families aren't able to find meaning. And in the book, I go into that a little bit more in this relatively short lecture. There wasn't time to kind of look at every side of the situation. But the tipping point is often when parents see that their child is capable of thriving, and they redefine their idea of what it is to thrive. I mean, Emily Pearl Kingsley, who has a son with Down syndrome, wrote very movingly and spoke to me very movingly about spending time with him and about the moment when, after she had spent ages sort of showing him things and saying what the words were, she said to him, "Point to the flower." He was still a very young child, and he pointed to a flower. And she realized he was actually hearing what she said and understanding it, and she felt like there was communication. And that point of establishing communication, which is often important even with children who don't have any difference or disability, can often be the tipping point. But it really varies from family to family. Some people find it easy to make the shift. Most people spend the first few years struggling to come to terms with what has happened to their lives. And then bit by bit, they come to fall in love with their child, and their child's identity becomes more manifest and more evident. Then again, there are the people for whom there is no tipping point who don't fall in love with their child in that way. But I think that while we all hear stories of neglect and abuse, especially for disabled people, I think most people love their children, and most parents want the best they can do for their children. And that the tipping point really has to do with that conviction of parents that they have to do their best with the child they've been given. Should here in the front.
Could you speak to the challenge that many families who represent high social economic status have in accepting the reality of disability?
I think parents who are more privileged frequently are also more accustomed to being able to fix things and make them turn out all right. There's a tendency for people with higher socioeconomic status to have more self-determination and to have fewer things that they just have to accept that have gone wrong in their lives. So those parents often have a big adjustment to having a child who has a condition that can't be fixed and to no longer being in control of their life narrative in the same way that they have. So it's difficult to talk about this and to talk about the fact that people with lower socioeconomic status may arrive at acceptance faster without seeming to kind of honey the experience of people who are of lower socioeconomic status. There is no question that in terms of taking care of a child with differences in disabilities, if you can afford respite care, you are in a much better place than if you can't. If you can afford to have helpers who come in and help you with things, you're in a better position. And frankly, if you can afford to sue the state that you live in to get the services to which you're entitled, you're going to get a lot more services than the people who can't. And it's really, really a bad system because the people who most need those services are the people who are of lower socioeconomic status. But I think it's often the case that people with lower socioeconomic status, I mean, there was a day I was struck by when I interviewed two women in a row. One of them had a lot of privilege and one of them had no privilege. And the one with a lot of privilege kept talking about all these interventions for her son with autism and how they hadn't worked and what a burden it was and how terrible she felt and how frustrated she was. And the second woman who I talked to said that she had never really tried to find a cure because she had never really known how to begin to go about it. Her son who had a very similar situation, who had similar autism. The first woman had said it was terrible. He lives away, but when he comes, you have to put everything away because he would smash things. And the second woman said to me, whatever could be smashed got smashed a long time ago. So I think that's the dynamic. But as I say, I don't ever want to say that in a way that suggests that it's easy for people of low SES somewhat different reasons and in different ways. I'm right behind you.
So I'd love to talk, and maybe this is a qualitative response in terms of just the families you've been able to interview, but I'm wondering if you've noticed any difference in parents who maybe their first child was the child who had, the significant disability, the significant issue, they had what we would consider a typical child first, and then had a child.
Well, I think the difference there is that parents whose first child have differences in disability understand the context into which their second child will be born and can decide before the second child is born to make a series of decisions that will probably all go out the window when the child actually arrives. But they can at least think about before the child is born how to make a child who will, how to bring up the second child in the context of the first child's challenges. If you have a first child who's doing very well, and then you have a second child who's different, you have to suddenly readjust the dynamics of your family, and that can be a complicated thing to do sort of while you're in motion trying to get whatever treatments or supports your child requires. So that can be very different, but I'm always interested by these stories. There was one story that to me was heartbreaking. There was a woman who was pregnant with a child and got a diagnosis of dwarfism, and dwarfism is, according to the OBGYNs I've talked to, one of the hardest diagnoses that they make. And so this woman received the diagnosis of dwarfism, and she got in touch with some families of people with dwarfism and asked them about their experience. And she talked in particular to a kind of amazing, wonderful woman I know who is the mother of a daughter with dwarfism. And they kept saying to her on the phone that our other daughter is a cheerleader. It would be so strange to have a daughter who can't do that. And Betty said, well, look, it's really not so bad, and you can really adjust in all of these ways. She said, and if you feel you can't take care of your child, there are a lot of dwarf families who are eager to adopt children with dwarfism. And the mother ended up terminating the pregnancy in the 8th month. Betty talked about her sort of sense of great mourning for this child who could have found many other loving contexts, but they just felt that they had one daughter who was a cheerleader and that there was going to be too much injustice in their house if they had another daughter who was so different. Anyone else? Sorry, it's a heavy talk. There's someone at the back here.
Question about language.
I'm going to pass it.
Can you comment about the terminologies that are used for describing these conditions? Consider modelism is not a term that's any longer in use, but it was once the dominant term to describe Down syndrome. There must be many other patterns of this sort that have come across your radar during the course of your research.
Well, look, vocabulary is always evolving, and it evolves as people are able to assert more and more control over their world and their lives. I mean, our words for people who belong to racial minorities have also vastly changed over the course of the same period of time. So, we no longer say Chinaman, and we no longer say a colored person, and we just don't use a lot of language that was at one point acceptable. The changes in disability include, of course, people first language. It's interesting how some people with disabilities are now rejecting people first language. Jim Sinclair, whom I quoted in the talk, said, calling me a person with autism is like calling someone a person with Catholicism or a person with maleness. I'm not a person with maleness. I'm male. I think he's Catholic. He said, and I'm autistic, and I want to be called an autistic person. So there's been a bit of back and forth about all of that. There's still a certain amount of respect involved in saying that people who experience their condition as disability are not so defined by it that it comes ahead. Susan Weinreich said in the video, I'm not a schizophrenic, I'm Susan, and the importance of establishing individual identity. I think it's forever evolving. And I think some of the time it's evolving in ways that are very helpful, and some of the time it gets a little carried away with itself. There's the whole movement for calling disabled people differently abled, and a friend of mine said that she was feeling differently crutchled. That's a sort of learning process. I think the respectful thing is insofar as people are able to speak for themselves, to allow people who have any given condition to say how they would like to be referred to, and how they would like not to be referred to, and to defer to them as much as possible. what is the language that you find most supportive, at least consulting, and to stick with it. Time for one more question, and it's right there.
Could you talk a little bit about the challenges and journey to acceptance for families who have a child who starts out typical and then develops something that fundamentally changes, like who the child is?
So that's also, that's a good question. That's also a complicated question. The reason that I was most interested in schizophrenia as a chapter in the book is because it's a late diagnosis condition. Most people who develop schizophrenia develop it between the ages of 15 and 25 rather than in early childhood or infancy like so many of the conditions I was looking at. And frequently the parents find it almost impossible to wrap their minds around the fact that this person who used to be their child who was fine is now their child who has all of these challenges and problems. And while things can go very well for people with schizophrenia, and some people respond well to treatment, and some people have remarkable lives even dealing with the condition, I don't think there's anyone who said, this was such an enriching and meaningful experience, and in a way I'm glad we had it. There's some mad improvement, but despite that, people don't say that for things that say it later. I found when I talked to people who had so-called regressive autism, where their children had appeared to be typical until the age of 2, and then have begun to develop symptoms of autism, that there was this sense of constantly yearning backward toward what we thought we knew him. I remember what he was like. There were things I could see in him. I go into this a little bit in the film of Bark the Tree, and it's certainly in the book as well. It's a huge adjustment. It's in some ways easier to know right at the beginning what you're dealing with. The other piece of that I would add is that prognosis is also very helpful. So a lot of people have children who've got these sort of not very clearly defined conditions in which they have certain disabilities, but they don't know quite what they have. So I described with these two children with very severe disabilities. Were never able to get a description. Nobody could figure it out. They scanned their genome. They couldn't figure out what was going on with those kids. And so I think if you have diagnosis, you have prognosis. If you know what condition your child has, you have some idea of what the course is likely to be over a lifetime for that child. If you don't have a clear diagnosis at the beginning, then prognosis is very shady and very murky. And if you have a condition that sets in later, frequently the prognosis is very vague, and that's very hard for people to live with because they never know. If we work really hard, will we be able to bring about this level of behavior? If we work really hard, are we just going to drive ourselves and our child crazy and not accomplish anything? It's that unknowing that I think becomes particularly forgiving. So I was told that was the last question. It's been a pleasure to speak with you. I'll be signing books